So the talk tonight is on proportional representation, and we've got Tom Lines from Make Votes Matter to talk to us on that and give us some food for thought. So if I'll ask Tom to introduce himself and then go into his talk. If he can do any questions via the chat, and then I'll put them to Tom at the end. I'll mute everybody. And then we'll see how that goes. There's a copy of Tom's main slide on the chat if anyone wants to download it. Then, Tom.
Okay, well, let me say what a pleasure it is to meet you all and to take part in this meeting. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm sure everyone in the Green Party is aware what an important topic this is. I was quite interested a few months ago when a Make Votes Matter group was formed in Brighton with a meeting in the upstairs room of a pub, which about 15 or 20 people turned up to from various parties. And I was interested to see that there were some Lib Dems there who sort of, you know, said, well, yes, we're in favour of PR, and that was about it. And they were quite enthusiastic about it. But there were some Greens, besides myself, some other Greens, and it struck me that the Greens actually had thought about it much more and were saying other things, constitutional things. And I think it is a feature. I'm a member of the Green Party, as I maybe didn't make clear. And I think it is interesting, the Green Party does take constitutional issues very seriously, and I think rightly so. It's just one of those things. I come here as a representative of Make Votes Matter, which is a relatively new organisation. You're probably all aware of the Electoral Reform Society, which is a kind of think tank, which does reports and lobbying and so on. It's been going for a long time. It's a very valuable work. But recently, some people decided, yes, but they want to get on more of a campaign footing. So Make Votes Matter has been created with local groups and so on to do grassroots type of stuff. And it's very, very decentralized and grassroots based. And so they're trying to get as many meetings as this going as they can with different kinds of groups around the country. And they've simply asked members who are willing to do so to come forward and offer to do talks on behalf of MVM. And I was one of them. And when this talk came up, they said, well, why don't you do that one? So here I am. Now, that's Make Votes Matter. What I've been asked to do by David is various things, talk about the various types of PR. And I recognize that's a complicated thing and quite detailed, and I'll try not to get bogged down or to make it too long. And I've tried to find a way to actually organize it so that it's a bit more logical and it's not just a maze of jargon. And then suggest some of the things about how far we've got with PR and how we can move it forward. But the main thing is if I can go on, I'm not quite sure how to do this. If I go on to my charts that I've put there, that's it, yes, and yes, indeed. So what I've done here is, yes, that's it, full screen, thank you. I've simply drawn up a chart of the different types of electoral system, organized them in two different ways, really. You've got, first of all, you can look at the rankings down the left. Now, these I've taken from the Electoral Reform Society. They are its assessments of how, it's a ranking, they do other kinds of ranking also of these systems, but this is their ranking according to degree of proportionality, with the least proportional at the top and the most proportional getting the 5. That's on the vertical scale. Horizontally, it's according to the way at what level, if you like, elections are organised. That's to say whether you have single member electoral districts like the British system with a constituency which elects a single MP, and there are 650 of them around the country, or a multi-member system, several of them around the country, each of which though elects a number, more than one member. Or indeed, as you have in some cases, as it were, a single national constituency on the right. And then also at the bottom, you've got two systems which are called hybrid or mixed, because they include, they include bits of two different systems in order to try and get advantages of both. And so if I go through the first lot at the top left, basically I would say, although they have different names, these are all variants of the British first past the post system, which is the oldest and simplest, at least conceptually, the simplest system that exists. It's also a system which is perfectly all right when you have undoubtedly a two-party system. So in the 1950s, when there were just virtually two parties in Parliament, the Liberals maybe had 5 or 6 seats, but that was it. They got a very small share of the vote. And first past the post was all right. You got a majority government, usually from the party that got the most votes, so that wasn't the case in 1951. And it's okay, but as soon as you get into the territory we're in this country now, with a multi-party system, you get into trouble, which I'm sure I don't need to repeat to you. However, I think it is worth bearing in mind that those who defend first past the post, they do have 1 or 2 good points. One thing which they always talk to, partly because they tends to more favoured by people on the right who tend to favour things like stability and order and one thing to another, is that it is reputed to be more inclined to produce relatively strong, stable governments which can last the course from one general election to another and be in fairly firm control of what's going on in the government and in Parliament so that they can get their business through. Secondly, another advantage is simply the fact of it being a local system, that each one of us has our own MP who we identify with, and they, if they're any good at their job, they identify with the constituency. That's a personal link, which I think is very important. It is a genuine strength of this system. If you move across the page though, now if you see though, on the other hand, there are very, very few countries left that use first past the post. In Europe, it's only the United Kingdom and, interestingly, Belarus. You know what's happening with their politics now. Now, this is for single member constituencies. It can also be used, is used in this country in a multi-member sense in local elections in England. Interestingly, not in Scotland, where council elections now have a proportional system. But in England, it is used for local elections, even where we have 2 or 3 members per ward, which seems to me, that multiplies the disadvantages of first past the post. Because if I take, for example, Brighton, where I live, I'm most familiar with that, we have 3 parties on the council with relatively equal weight, Green, Labour and Conservative, but they are divided up. The town is divided into blocks. So you have green wards, Labour wards and Conservative wards. It would be much healthier if you had maybe the same number of councillors per party, but divided, represent each one scattered around the town. So that in my ward, there might be, instead of 3 Greens, you might have 2 Greens and a Labour councillor, for example, under a proportional system. The other 3 things I've got against number 2 here, well, let's go back to number 1. The US uses first past the post for its lower house federal elections, House of Representatives, and also for the presidency, but via the Electoral College, which is something like having a constituency. But the Electoral College, as you probably know, works with, it's a block vote, so that it's not each state simply gives all its votes in the Electoral College to the one that got the most votes under a system that's weighted according to population, which can produce even more perverse results than first past the post, it seems to me. If you think that in 2 of the last 5 presidential elections, the winner was not, in a 2-party system, was not the candidate that got the most votes, both in 2000 and 2016. That one ranking, that's my own invention, it doesn't come from the ERS. Then you've got the 3 systems here, which were designed to deal with some of the disadvantages of first past the post, to to put, if you like, the supporters of the less popular candidates still to give them a bit of a say so that they might be better reflected in the outcome. First is, and most famous, I suppose, is the French system, which apparently has been around since the early 19th century. It's a very old system which has been used from time to time in France, including under the Fifth Republic since 1958. And here you have a first past the post election under the same rules as in Britain, except that they then go back another time to vote again. What happens, it works slightly differently in different kinds of election. In the presidential election, what happens is that the top two candidates are kind of creamed off. They go back 2 weeks later, and there's a runoff between those two candidates. So as you got last time, Macron getting something like 26% of the votes first time round, and he was then elected with a majority against Le Pen on the second round. In national elections for the National Assembly, parliamentary elections, it's a slightly different system. They have, what happens is that any candidate who gets at least 12.5% of the vote, so quite a low barrier, can go into the second round. I think it's 1 week later, which means you can have 3 or even 4, quite a number of different candidates in the second round. But sometimes you will find that some of those candidates will drop out because they think, I'm not going to get elected. So the second round takes place then according to first past the post rules. And they might think, well, let's give a chance to that other party, which is a bit close to us, in order to prevent one we don't like getting elected. Now, this is not a proportional system. It has an advantage of it over first past the post is that on the first round of voting, you can vote for the party you really want. There's no disincentive to do so, as there is in the British system. If you want to vote Green, you can vote Green and see how it goes. Or if you want to vote Lib Dem or whatever other smaller parties there are. And that does also mean that some of those parties do get into the second round and they do get elected. So you tend to have a more diverse parliament, a greater number of parties represented in the French National Assembly. On the other hand, it is not necessarily any more proportional. I remember in 1981, for example, when Mitterrand was first elected president, he dismissed the parliament, had new elections, and the Socialist Party, his Socialist Party, was elected with a clear majority on 37% of the votes. If anything, even worse than it can be in Britain. So that's France. Then you've got 2 systems which were devised to try and do the same sort of thing in France, but without voters having to go back to vote a second time. You've got the supplementary vote, which is used in this country for the directly elected mayors and the police commissioners, where you get, basically you get 2 votes. You put a cross against your favoured candidate, and then in a second column, you can put a second cross, either against the same candidate, but there's not much point in that, or against your second favoured candidate. And then the less well-placed candidates on the first round from the first column drop out, and their second preference votes are reassigned. So you've got a chance of getting perhaps slightly more of a consensus result. And then you've got the alternative vote, which is used for the Australian, I'm not sure what it's, is it House of Commons in Australia, House of Representatives, whatever it is, the lower house. And also I've put actually the Green Party's system in here, where it is for individuals, although in the party it's generally called single transferable vote, but it's the same system where you're voting for individuals such as the leader of the party or a member of the House of Lords. And under this system, as you know from when you voted in our party elections, you put numbers, you write down the candidates in order of preference, 1, 2, 3, as far as you want to go. And of course, in the Green Party, we also have our old friend Ron for reopened nominations. And then these votes get progressively reassigned. First of all, the one who gets the least first preference votes drops out, and their second preferences are assigned to the other candidates, and so on, until you reach a point when one of the candidates has got 50%. Now that is certainly more consensual. it enables people to vote for who they definitely want to vote for. It doesn't enable, it makes you. If the candidate you want is X, then that is who you put in first place. You don't have to worry about tactical considerations. If they don't get up top, okay, then your other preferences are taken into account. So it can produce more consensual results, but it isn't any more proportional. It is not a proportional system. Now, as you see, gradually as we get more proportional, you also get to larger types of electoral base, larger areas from which people are elected. Number 3 here is a bit of a curiosity. It's not actually used, I understand, in any political election. It's called the border count. I assume that border was someone's name, but I don't know. It's the system used for the Eurovision Song Contest, which you might be familiar with, which is a point system, where if you've got, say, 20 or 25 songs in the contest, each country then can give votes to 12 of them. It gives 1 vote for their 12th favorite song and 12 for the biggest favorite, and that can lead to some pretty perverse results. I won't go into the details, but it also tends to lead to a kind of middle ground, a kind of consensual result. More seriously, we come to the single transferable vote. Now this, from what I've read in the literature, is widely considered by the political scientists to be the best system, although it's not actually the most popular. In fact, it is not a popular system. It's quite a rare system. The only countries that use it, as I've read, are Malta and the Republic of Ireland. Although in the Green Party, we also do use it for things like where there are numerous candidates to be elected, for example, for a committee, or for our candidates, electing candidates for the European Parliament, as we did. And again, you know the system. It's just what I described for the alternative vote, but in a multi-member, constituency, which is what they have in Ireland. They have had that ever since independence in the Republic. And interestingly, it is also used in Northern Ireland. Because, of course, after the end of the Troubles, after the Good Friday Agreement, they could not go back in Northern Ireland to first past the post. The use and abuse of that system by the Unionists in the first 50-odd years after Northern Ireland was created was what led to the Troubles, directly or indirectly. So under the Irish system, therefore, I think what the political scientists like about STV is that it produces a considerable degree of proportionality, as you see assessed by the ERS at moderate number 3, so considerably above what we have in Britain anyway. It also, though, retains the local link. Your member of the Dáil, your TDs rather, members representing your, you do have members of the Dáil in your multi-member constituency. So there's that personal link. You are voting for individuals and not just a party. And that system, but also the multi-member, nature of the constituency, where you're likely if you've got, say, 4, 5 or 6 TDs representing the constituency, it has an added advantage in that if suppose you support one of the smaller parties, well, it doesn't matter. Your party is more likely to have a local member. So there might be, for example, 5 members representing the constituency. They might represent 3 different parties. So that if you voted for the party that's only got 1 member elected, that is someone more sympathetic to you, who you can approach if you've got something you want to raise, rather than as for example, you might find where you have an MP that you feel rather unsympathetic with. You would much rather be in the position I'm in, where fortunately I have an MP that I actually voted for. That's definitely that's an advantage. On the other hand, from what I've heard anecdotally, it has another slightly perverse outcome in Irish elections, and that arises from the fact that, let us say, give that example again, 5 members elected, and you now look at it from the point of view of one of the larger parties. Let's say they can be reasonably sure of getting 2 of those 5 members. And one of them might be an incumbent, might be a very popular local politician. They'll get in. You are one of the other 5. What you will be wanting to do as much as anything is actually get ahead of the other candidates from your party. So in elections in Ireland, so I have heard, and maybe some of you have closer connections in Ireland than I have, and you can confirm or deny this, there's a rather curious results that the elections are as much between candidates of the same party as they are between the different parties. So that's been at least been mentioned as a slightly problematic issue with STV. Now, those are all constituency-based systems of one sort or another, and individual-based systems, emphasizing the fact of electing individual representatives. Now we come to what is, in fact, by far the most widespread system of election in the world, which is the party list system. According to the Electoral Reform Society, I'm just trying to find out where it's written down here, it says, of the 43 countries most often considered to be within Europe, 40 use some form of proportional representation. Of these, 31 use party list systems. Another of the websites that I've listed at the bottom of the page cites, this is from memory, I think it said 91 countries around the world, of which 80 use, 91 parties using PR, of which 80 use party lists. So it's a very, very widespread form of election. So it's very important. It was first used, I put Belgium there as an example, because it was the first country to use it apparently in 1900. And I've also mentioned that it was used in this country once we had to use PR for European Parliament elections. There are 2 ways, and it worked out in this country, you had regional lists. The country was divided into regions. And so I don't know how many MEPs did you have in the Southwest? Was it 7 or 6, whatever it was? We had 8 or 9 in the Southeast. And each party would then draw up a list of candidates to fill up, as it were, trying to get all those seats. And then you put a cross against just one of those parties. And then there's a mathematical system used to work out, proportionately with the number of votes per party, how many of their members of their lists each would get elected. This was first used in Belgium. That mathematical system was devised by a Belgian called Mr. de Hont. And it was first used in Belgium for their national parliament in 1900. And Belgium is a very decentralized country, so it's certainly, that is certainly done on a regional basis there. There is, de Hont, cricket fans will be familiar with that name perhaps because it's also the same system is used in one-day matches, 50-over matches, if the match is cut short and they have to work out how many runs the second side has to go for. in a depleted match. There's the Hont version, the Hont method calculation is used. There's an alternative counting system though, devised in Europe. It's called the Sainte-Laguë system after a Frenchman who devised it. The same system though was also thought up by an American called Webster. So it's sometimes called the Webster system. And it just uses slightly different mathematics. It tends to produce a more proportional result. The Hont tends somewhat to favor the larger parties and disfavor the smaller ones, as we saw in the European Parliament elections. There was a big threshold between about 7 and 13% between the number of votes that the Green Party tended to get and the number that the Lib Dems tended to get. They tend to get a lot more than twice as many seats. I mentioned Sainte-Laguë, but also there's a disadvantage apparently of Sainte-Laguë in that it can lead to a result where the party with the greatest number of votes does not get the greatest number of seats. But I've given it an honourable mention here because the Irish Green Party apparently recommend it for use in Irish national elections. So I think it's worth mentioning. Now, at the top of the page, where I showed what I said are, in a sense, different variants of first past the post, or different variants at least of the single member constituency system. What you have, but they all have different names, which is rather confusing. To say that the second round system is similar to the supplementary vote system, that's, you know, they have very different names. Under party list system, there are also a number of variants which are used here and there, but you cannot, also party list, before I go on to that, there are two ways of devising it, either on regional lists, as we did in Britain for the EP elections, or having a single list for the whole country, which I put on the right, a single national, as though it's one huge constituency, and each party just draws up, if they've got, if it's a small country with, say, 100 members of parliament, they might draw up a list of 100 members for, to put before the voters. Now, though there are various variations to this, tweaks that are done to party list systems in different places to deal with issues that arise from it. But they are not, you cannot say that they are different systems in the way that the ones I described earlier, because they're not mutually exclusive. If you have a supplementary vote system, you cannot also have an alternative vote system. They are actually different systems. Whereas you can, with these variants, you can have different combinations of them or none of them at all. So what are they, besides the different ways of counting the votes that I've mentioned? First of all, the two main ones are the first two, a closed list or an open list. Those are the main things. A closed list is what we used in Britain, again, for the European Parliament, where the party draws up a list of candidates in order of the party's preference. And then if they get, say, 3 candidates elected in one region, then the top 3 on the list go forward. And the voter has no further say, they just vote for the candidate, for the party. Under an open system, an open list system, the voter can actually put a cross against a particular candidate, even if they're low down the list. And then that then is taken into account, showing a preference for that candidate, rather than simply the party as a whole. So it introduces something of a personal element into it. And then there's also a system of local lists, which I probably shouldn't put there because I'm not sure I've altogether understood it. It's used in the Nordic countries, and it's basically a kind of second vote that you add with a different kind of system supposed to compensate. I think it's something more like a first past the post system in addition to the party list, and they get extra representatives assigned according to that. Then the question of, maybe I should say, I've been prattling on. Please, have you got any questions or comments at this stage? Anything that's unclear in particular that you want to ask about?
There's one question, Tom.
Yes.
The party list system, you said, uses a mathematical system for counting.
Yes.
Is that some kind of algorithm then?
I suppose you could call it that, yes.
Mystery.
Yes, it is. That's what it is. But you know, it's trusted. It's basically it's generally the d'Hondt system, and it's been used, you know, in numerous countries around the world for over 100 years. It works. It gives reliable results, which are understandable if you know enough mathematics to understand it. And it does produce results which are roughly proportional with the number of votes cast per party.
And under the party list system, how does an independent or a small party?
Well, that depends. If there's a closed list, generally it depends on the country. Either they can't get in, or they can simply go forward, get nominations to just be on their own. And if they're popular enough, they might get elected. But of course, that's a disadvantage. And an advantage actually of single member constituencies is that an independent has a greater chance of getting elected.
Yeah.
because they got to appeal to a smaller number of voters. So they more easily get more independence in local government, or more small parties more easily elected, as you know, in local government at ward level than you do at constituency level, all the more so at multi-member constituency level. So even where independents can be included under a closed or open party list system, they are at a great disadvantage. It is a party-based system. And indeed, there is a small number of countries, both Italy and France, have moved back away from proportional representation, interestingly. Italy has a mixed system now. In France, though, in 1958, they had a rather complicated, I think probably not very satisfactory, party, I think it was a party list system under the Fourth Republic. And when de Gaulle came back and formed the Fifth Republic, they went back to the first past the post system with the second round, which did indeed lead to much more stable government. The Fourth Republic was criticized. It had, I think, 25 governments in 12 years. Where were we? And the criticism that certainly the Gaullists made of the Fourth Republic's electoral system, it was nicknamed le régime des partis, the regime of the parties. And indeed, I was in France in 1986 when Mitterrand was in power, and he could see that the socialists were not going to win the forthcoming National Assembly election. So he reintroduced proportional representation in order to make sure that the right wing, the Gaullists, didn't get a majority, typical sort of Mitterrand trick. But that proved very unpopular. The French did not want to go back to the system, and it was described even then, still 30 years nearly after the end of the Fourth Republic, as le régime des partis. What was meant by that? It was a system in which the way you voted really didn't make too much difference, as was thought. What happened all depended on behind-the-scenes deals between the parties, and it was all set up by the parties for their own benefit. And also it was a somewhat manipulated system, which was devised to the benefit of a certain group of parties. I think that was an added weakness of it. But when we come to that, this question of the party domination, question of thresholds. Now, one criticism of a party list system or any proportional system is that it does tend to put too many parties into the chamber. It doesn't necessarily produce any particularly strong parties which can dominate a government. And this can lead to weak government, instability, and so on. And this was seen, for example, in Israel, I've mentioned it there, where a big problem in Israel in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of very small, very right-wing, largely religious parties, but they tended to get into government to pull the major parties up to a level, even if they only had one or two members of the Knesset. They became junior members of the coalition, and that dragged the governments of Israel over quite a long period, well over to the right, further right than they would have been, because the big parties, the Likud and even the Labour Party, when they were dominating a coalition, they had to keep these junior members of the coalition happy. And that is an argument, another argument that's used against PR, that under these coalition systems, the tail can wag the dog. And therefore, one thing that has been done is to say, well, you won't get every party that stands for election necessarily represented. They have, before their votes are put into the calculation, they have to get a certain minimum share, which I understand. I don't think they used to have that in Israel, but I read somewhere that it's now 3.25%. In Germany, it's 5%. We'll come to Germany. They use a party list system as part of their mix. And this does mean that therefore you do get, you lose some of that disadvantage of a multi-party proportional system. On the other hand, you have to be very careful where to set the threshold. In Turkey, for example, they have a 10% threshold. And I'm not actually sure. I put Turkey as having a single national system. That might not be right. It might be a regional party list system, but that doesn't matter from this point of view. What happened there, curiously, at a time rather like Britain in recent years, the traditional major parties in Turkey were losing credibility, and a lot of parties came to the election a few years ago, but only 2 of them got over 10% of the votes. However, neither of those, I think the one that got the most votes got something like 22%. So so that the parliament was actually made up of 2 parties who between them had well under something like 40% of the votes, which therefore obviously means a very unproportional outcome. So if you set the bar too high, that has that alternative danger. And there's also in Germany, there was also definitely it was criticized for the tail wagging the dog over a long period. Curiously, in Germany, they never, the first time under the Federal Republic that a government changed as a result of a general election was in 1998, when the Republic had existed for nearly 50 years. That was when the Kohl-led coalition was defeated by the SPD, and the Greens were their coalition partners. What had happened previously was that for a very long time, basically you had the Free Democrat Party, which before the Greens got into parliament was the third of only 3 parties in the Bundestag, which it was kind of the kingmaker. And it was kind of permanently in power, whether the main party in the coalition was the SPD or the CDU. And famously, for example, in the early 80s, they had supported the SPD led by Helmut Schmidt, and the FDP decided they didn't like it anymore, and they brought that government down and supported a new coalition with the CDU under Helmut Kohl. And they also got very, very good, they bargained very, very effectively to get a lot of very powerful positions in government, including their leader, I think it was Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who was the foreign minister for something like 18 or 20 years. And very peculiarly, I remember some of those elections, they never got as much as 10% of the votes. And there were some elections when people were being encouraged to vote FDP even if they didn't really want to, because the opinion polls suggested they might not reach the 5% threshold, and then they wouldn't get into parliament. And the CDU desperately wanted them to be in parliament to keep the coalition going, because if the FDP didn't get in, then it would be an SPD government. So that is a perverse result, even when you've got thresholds, potentially. Another way of dealing with something like that, used in some countries, such as Greece, is what's called the majority bonus. And that is, you have a party list system where you do all the calculations, work out how many seats each party gets, and then whichever party has the greatest number of seats is given an additional number of seats in order to bring it closer to a majority, or even get it into a majority and put it into a strong position as the governing party, to try and bring some of the benefits that are attributed to the first part of the post system, into the party list system. So that's another tweak that can be done. Finally, I know I've gone on for a very long time, but this is quite complicated. 2 mixed systems. One, as you'll see, is not used anywhere, and I think never has been. I mentioned it though, because the Blair government in 1997 set up a commission on proportional representation, which was headed by Roy Jenkins, and it recommended the alternative vote plus. And it's the alternative vote system, but with a second vote. With a second vote, which is on, I'm going to have to check this, I think it's on the party list system. Alternative vote plus. You have the alternative vote in which you rank candidates in order of preference. And then you vote again on a small top-up list to make the overall result more proportional. With the top-up list, voters can either select their favorite party or choose their favorite candidate from the top-up list. and those votes are then reallocated. Something like what happens under the supplementary vote. In fact, it kind of combines the alternative vote and the supplementary vote to produce something which, again, would like to bring a more consensual result, perhaps, and give, at least if you're not going to win, you get some say in who is elected. But on the other hand, that is not as proposed by the Jenkins Commission proposed 80 to 85% of the members should come from the first vote, the alternative vote. And that means that it was not going to be a very proportional system. And then there's the additional, what's called the additional member system, which is the German system, where you have two votes. One is a standard British style first past the vote post system. But then you also have a party list system. You have a second vote, which goes to regional party lists, as Germany is a decentralized country, according to the Länder. And so those votes are then calculated, and the number of votes in the number of seats in the Bundestag is assigned according to the results of the second vote. So that if, for example, you're the CDU, you will get a lot of first vote candidates on representing constituencies, and you get a small top up from the party list. If you're the Green Party or the Left Party, for example, you will probably not get any, not even try to win any constituency seats, because it's not worth the effort. You will simply go for a party list system. If you get above the 5% threshold, though, you will get into the Bundestag with, suppose you get 7% of the votes, with 7% of the seats. More or less, because it's done region by region, but it comes to fairly close to the results. With the advantages and disadvantages that I've already described. I don't think I need to add to that. One aspect of it, though, is that it does take several days usually to actually reach the final result, because there are a lot of calculations to be done region by region. And it also has a slightly odd result that even after the votes have been cast, they're not quite sure how many members there are going to be in the Bundestag. There's some curious mathematical reasons why that can vary according to the outcomes of the second list. So that's what I have to say about the actual systems. Finally, if I may, a few comments on where we stand. First of all, the Green Party's policy, which I looked into. I wasn't actually aware of it, but if you're curious. And I think it's actually the chapter in the policy, what is it, the PSS, the Policies for a Sustainable Society. The chapter, I think it's called Government and Constitution, or Administration and Government. It's actually a very interesting chapter. There's some very interesting proposals for revising for a written constitution for this country, including, of course, electoral reform. And the Green Party goes, well, first of all, it's typically guarded and nuanced, saying it supports electoral reform at all levels, and of the various electoral systems available, we would consider the STV alternative vote plus and additional member systems to be entirely acceptable. But it then does come down in favour, interestingly, for Westminster elections, of the alternative vote plus. But it doesn't say what the proportions would be. I imagine we would want to have less than 80% coming from the constituency section, something more like the German system. But instead of having the constituency votes coming from first past the post, they come from the alternative vote. I think something like that is the idea, but it's open to interpretation. And then for local government elections, a single transferable vote. The Irish system applied potentially to the wards, to multi-member wards that we already have. That's the position that the party stands on at the moment. As for what's happened recently, there was the referendum. David asked why it did not result in PR, the 2011 referendum during the coalition government. And I think a part of that was actually that it wasn't actually proposing proportional representation. The alternative offered, it was either first past the post or the alternative vote, which was not a huge difference, to be quite honest. It did not propose a proportional system. And a lot of people who wanted PR thought, well, what the hell? Why bother to vote? It's not going to produce a significant enough change. Quite apart from the politics of the time, that it was the Lib Dems were simply, they didn't manage to persuade Cameron that if you're having an election on a referendum on PR, well, you really ought to have it on PR and not on a non-PR system. What might be the best system for the UK? I don't think I want to comment on that. I've told you what the Green Party's official policy is, but I think it's much more interesting to hear what you all have to say, what you think seems best. But where we are, I think we're at a very interesting moment at the moment, because for the first time, it looks as though the Labour Party might be open to PR. At long last, after the results of the December election, a lot of people in the Labour Party seem to have realised that they are chasing a dream in thinking that they can get back to 1945 and have years and years of, or even 1966, and get large majorities in Parliament and get the Tories out of the way and push through their politics on their own without combining with other parties. Interestingly, there was much more support for PR among the Corbynites than there has been traditionally on the right of the Labour Party. Although there's been a current in favour of it for a long time. Robin Cook advocated PR, for example, and the far left in the past, in the 80s, certainly didn't like it. But it may be because the Corbynites, the momentum people, were younger anyway. And I think younger people tend to be more in favour of shaking up the system and including PR. Anyway, the word is that Keir Starmer seems to be quite keen on PR. So maybe Labour will eventually go through to a general election proposing PR. You never know your luck. On that, possibly, hopefully, if you all agree with me that we want some kind of PR, possibly optimistic note, let me stop there and apologise for taking up so much of your time with my talk.
No, thank you very much, Tom. A lot of detail in there that I certainly wasn't aware of. Couple of questions. The fact that Green Party recommends alternative vote plus for Westminster, but STV for local elections. Why do you think that might be? It seems odd thinking of two different systems. Is it just the multi-member aspect?
I think you would have to ask the people. Do we need the chart up on the screen anymore, by the way?
No, I can take that down.
And then I can see the chat myself. Why? You would have to ask the people who framed that policy and voted on it. I wasn't at the I think at the conference which passed that policy. I imagine that it's partly pragmatic, I think. For national elections, we're very far from a proportional. We've got the least proportional system, so we've got to introduce some kind of proportionality there, and they went for AV plus for whatever reason. I imagine on local elections, it is simply pragmatic, saying, well, look, we already have multi-member seats, multi-member wards. We don't need to shake it up, entirely. Let's stick with that, because that can more easily have an element of proportionality introduced. And at local level also, the personal contact, personal element, I suppose, is even more important than it is nationally. Yeah. I'm trying to ascribe reasons, I can only guess at it, but those might be the reasons that led to that result. It would be less of a shake-up to introduce STV into the existing system of council elections in multi-member wards.
Question here from Ursula. You sort of flagged there that when we had the referendum, it wasn't really on PR, so a lot of people who wanted PR didn't bother.
Yeah.
What is likely, or which systems, which type of PR is likely to cause the most dissent from within those who support PR? So I suppose, what's the biggest argument between, say, two of the options?
My guess is, I think we can only guess that, and it will obviously be different in different places. But I think one can see it's not just a kind of, it's not, I think, just a question of political traditions, but also something of a cultural difference between English-speaking countries and the rest of Europe. If you look at the fact that where first past the post survives, or something like it as in Australia, it is in English-speaking countries, countries that, you know, one way or another they derive, and they're the, you know, the as it were, the old white Commonwealth plus the US, from the Westminster system. But that's a wider cultural thing with a greater, if you like, greater emphasis on the individual rather than, if you like, the collectivity of the party and voting for, you know, things being defined according to parties, which seems to be something of a divide within Europe. And I think it's telling, in fact, if you look at STV, now that is a multi-member system, it's a proportional system, but it's interesting, it's in 2 former British ruled countries. It is Ireland and Malta that use that system. And Ireland, just after independence, they went straight into STV as something like an individual system like we have at Westminster, just adapting it so that people have more choice and you get a, you know, you get a greater range of parties represented and so on. And I think that might be telling because they, of course, were moving out of the away from the Westminster system. That's what they'd had before. And therefore, my guess is, in answer to your question, it might be a debate between those who want something more like an individual system, like Alternative Vote Plus or the STV on one hand, and the party list system on the other. But I also suspect that something like the German system would be pretty popular in this country, because I personally like it very much, because it does combine strengths of both systems, both types of system.
Okay.
But I'm only guessing. You know, your guess is as good as mine, really.
I sort of bit of devil's advocate here, but you know, a lot of people in the Green Party and sort of in Extinction Rebellion would probably say we haven't got time to wait for PR. You know, we've got to deal with the climate emergency. It's going to even, you know, even if we were moving fairly fast towards PR, it's going to take too long. We just need to get on with it. I mean, what are your views on that?
I agree with that. And particularly on that issue, I mean, the Extinction Rebellion says to hell with the, you know, traditional politics. It hasn't worked. I agree. Environment. I mean, you know, I've been watching for 50 years since the environmental movement began when I was at school, and we see how little progress it's made politically. Someone was saying, I only heard on the radio this morning, you know, according to a recent poll, a new poll, politicians in this country are a long way behind the public on environmental issues, and it's probably true around the world. And the Extinction Rebellion says, well, forget about Parliament. They were set up, the bill which Caroline's has put forward by Extinction Rebellion, which Caroline's proposed in Parliament, actually says, well, we need to put it to a citizens' assembly. The whole thing, the citizens' assembly aside, because the government has not done the job, they've failed. And I have a lot of sympathy with that. Also, on the other hand, I think that, you know, the Green Party stands for a complete change, a written constitution, removing any political powers from the monarchy, a complete shake-up. I think that is long overdue. And I actually think that while electoral reform is probably the most urgent element, it's nothing like sufficient. And it just needs, I think it needs to be part of a package with a whole new constitutional arrangement. My fear is, though, that with the country in its divided febrile state that it's in now, and with, you know, Scotland and who knows where, and Northern Ireland perhaps about to drop off it anyway, it might be suggesting radical changes, a major changes like a written constitution, weakening the monarchy and everything, that might just lead to a lot of trouble and the whole thing might break up. I actually have quite serious fears for the near-term future of this country, but that's another question.
Okay. There aren't any more questions on the chat, so what I'll do is ask you all to unmute if you wish to. If anyone wants to verbally ask Tom any more questions before we close.
People shuffling and debate, and, you know, everyone's sitting on their hands.
Who's saying that?
Should all be off mute now, I think most
You're
of
saying what?
But I'm just wondering, really, I mean, I sympathise with that response on PR, but I suppose it goes against the grain for me to give up on it in some way. Particularly, I guess I see the Labour Party as the big chance for this, and therefore, is that an area where Make Votes Matter is putting a lot of emphasis?
Yeah, absolutely. They have been. They're working as hard as they can on the Labour Party, and they are getting some results. And I think it's a very nice campaign. I mean, you know, I'm not giving up on PR because, you know, if I had done, I wouldn't have joined Make Votes Matter, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now this evening with you. So I don't go that far. I just don't think it's enough. And certainly Make Votes Matter, I think they're, as I say, it's a very nice, quite a small organisation, but I think they're pretty shrewd, and they have put a lot of, they're very good at kind of finding out, listening and finding out who they can work with, and particularly, for example, in the Labour Party, who they can press, and trying to get, you know, as many Labour constituency parties to give them a hearing so that they can decide, well, preferably, as they asked me as a Green Party member to speak to you, preferably someone from the Labour Party to speak to a Labour Party meeting to say why, from their point of view as Labour people, PR is advisable. And I think that's a very sensible strategy.
Johnny?
Hello, I'm not on mute. No, hi. This is not meant to be controversial, if I can say the word, but it's going to be. So, surely in our present climate, and as we've just heard your response to the protests and the approach of XR, proportional representation, and don't get me wrong, I truly believe in the principle of it, but as you have very well demonstrated tonight, oh my God, it's more complex than it needs to be. So truly, it's just too late. We are missing the boat. We are focusing on minutiae when the real picture is bigger than that. And we need to change the entire system.
Well, I agree with that, but I think part of the new system should be PR. Also my view of that, of course, you mentioned Extinction Rebellion and what happened when I was very interested in the one thing which really riled most of the media commentators and, of course, most of the politicians at Westminster was when they attacked the Murdoch thing. I thought that was very telling. And one thing, of course, it reminds me that actually a large part of the reason why the AV referendum failed was because the right-wing press came out against it. Yeah. And they have such unwarranted power in this country. And what you have to do is to not go into all the nerdy details like I have done. Now, you know, I did that because of the audience, and because, to some extent, because that's what David asked me to do. It does turn people off, I know. On the other hand, if you want to find out more about it in passing, I did put at the bottom of that chart 3 websites which I think do a good job in explaining it. The Electoral Reform Society, which provides very good summaries, very easily digested. Then there was a Wikipedia page, which goes into more details, mentions several systems that I didn't mention in greater detail, but it's good. And then a very, very detailed, highly technical thing. I think it's another American website. But no, you need to go into the general principles. And a very good example, I think, always to use is New Zealand, because it's a country that people are vaguely familiar with and generally sympathetic with. They think it's a sort of bit like this country because of its size, and it's, you know, it's 2 islands somewhere stuck in the middle.
It speaks the same language.
And it speaks the same language, and so on. And the New Zealanders tend to be pretty well disposed to towards this country, more than the Australians, for example, and all the rest of it. And they went over to PR, and they haven't regretted it in the least. It has led to much greater stability in government, greater turnout in elections, and so on. And as we found, a government which had enormous trust from its people and worked extremely well when it came to the pandemic. Unlike the governments of Britain and the United States elected under first past the post.
And which system do they actually use, Tom? Sorry.
Technical guy.
I think it's the party list system, but I couldn't tell you the details.
I'll check up independently. Thanks.
Yeah, please do, and tell me when you find the answer.
Okay.
But I mean, that's the sort of thing that you need to say in campaigning. It's not going to say, well, you know, we want to have this. I mean, that's exactly what turns people off proportional representation. You know, which system is and all that kind of nerdy stuff. But it is a topic for nerds. When I looked into it, I mean, I found there's not just one Wikipedia page on proportional representation. There are at least half a dozen that have the words proportional representation in the title.
It's just like Brexit, isn't it? Which Brexit do you want?
Yeah, well, yes.
Is there
which one are we actually going to get?
Yeah.
Is there any mileage in splitting the kind of campaign at all? I don't know, maybe not. I'm thinking off the top of my head of going for PR in local council elections as a kind of starting point or something, because I wonder whether people might kind of feel more inclined to do that, because it's a system I think that they can recognise, probably have seen in other places when they voted, and also it gets over this problem of a ward being entirely conservative or entirely green or whatever.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. To some extent, that's already happened. People perhaps don't really realise that we're already not just in Scotland and Wales, where of course their parliaments, and in Northern Ireland, where their parliaments and assemblies are all elected under PR. But all over the UK, we already have experience of PR in the European Parliament elections. And nobody had any difficulty with them. It's quite easy to understand. You put a vote against cross against the name of a party rather than against a candidate. That was easily digested, but even more complicated systems are not difficult to work out. You know, if you're asked to list the candidates in an order of preference rather than just putting a cross against one of them, well, people can do that quite easily. So, and as a way of easing ways in, I mean, there's another policy which I don't think it's appropriate now, but where I thought the citizen's income or basic income, I thought a good approach maybe sort of 15 years ago would have been to say, well, start off emphasizing the citizen's pension and say that everyone should get the same pension, and it should be whatever it is, but based not on contributions, not with any adjustment for for private pensions or anything, just to get people interested in the idea. And but at that time there was very little knowledge or support for the universal basic income. Now that's come to the fore in itself, so I think we can just go for that anyway. But you know, there was a time when I thought, you know, doing things by stages, easing people into radical changes, I think that's always a good idea, good approach.
But the problem with that is, if you're going to say, well, let's do local elections first, how many election cycles are you going to need for people to say, oh, well, it seems to be working okay? 10 years, 15 years? How long have we got?
Not that long. I guess where I'm going is that we are trying to tweak a system when the wholeness of our situation requires more than a tweak. It requires a radical change. But people they're not prepared for that. And people don't like change. We are habitual animals. And my question is not how can we tweak the system, but how can we prepare ourselves for when people go, oh my God, we're in deep, forgive my phrasing, but we're in deep doo-doo here. That was good phrasing. And therefore they can turn to the Green Party because the Green Party has said, yes, this is the way through. And they think, and as they have since the 1970s, think, oh, we're a bunch of hippie loving blah blah blah, and they'll go, oh right, these guys get it.
Well, you know what? I think it was at the time of the last election, there was a poll which you probably saw, saying it was rating parties according to their popularity, not whether they're going to vote for them, but whether they got positive or negative, had people that voted.
Yeah, whether they were cuddly.
And
Yeah.
the Green Party was the only party which had a net positive result.
Yeah.
But people are not hostile to us.
No.
They just don't think we can win. And when they look at individual policies of ours, also they very often prefer them to those of any other party.
Yeah.
But my problem with what you said is that I think by that time it will be too late anyway. I mean, I have a horrid fear that we're stuck anyway. That we're more than stuck. That we've already gone far too far before. No serious action is still being done about it. Let's face it. It's all rhetoric, say, oh, well, we'll do something in 30 years' time. Well, no, the problem is with it now.
Yeah.
Extinction Rebellion says zero carbon by 2025, and I think that might be 10 years too late, but at least we've got to go for it.
Yeah.
And anyway, I don't like the emphasis on zero carbon. We've got to get to a point where we're pulling, greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And pulling back from the situation we're in. It's no good just saying, well, let's stop at find a point where we stop. So I mean, I sympathise with you, but I mean, I'm sort of emotionally, I suppose, I'm neither a minimalist nor a maximalist. I have terrible fears. I think the whole system needs to be changed for political reasons as well as all the others. But I think also PR would make a substantial difference. So I'm quite happy to campaign for that, as well as supporting Extinction Rebellion and other, major things. See how it goes.
I suppose it's coming at it from all directions. And try and nibble away, and that might be successful, or might get you a little bit, and you attack it head on.
Yeah.
And between those two things, you get the movement. But yeah.
But the fact is that in this country, I mean, our party has always been up against it because of the electoral system.
Yeah.
I mean, when people on the continent, when they heard from whoever our MEPs were at the time, that we had won a constituency at Westminster with 30% of the votes, they were saying, in parties, other European parties, some of which had been in government, which were winning seats at every election. They said and they looked on the British Greens as being a bunch of ne'er-do-wells because we never got elected. And then they found that we got someone elected with over 30% of the votes in one place. And they thought, how the hell did you do that? We've never got anywhere near that. That's what the electoral system does to us. So we've got to keep going at it, I'm sure.
Perhaps I should confess at this moment that I'm not actually a member of the Green Party right now. I have been. I was for 8 years or so. Yeah. I resigned in January and applied to join the Labour Party.
Mm-hmm.
Very largely, partly because I wanted to go to the Labour Party and argue for PR.
Yeah.
And monetary theory as well, but that's another thing.
Uh-huh.
But they rejected my application because they think I'm still a member of the Green Party. And I've been waiting now for 8 months to have my appeal against that rejection heard, and I'm still not hearing anything.
That sounds fairly typical of the Labour Party to my ears.
I think one of the other problems the current system gives us, which we suffered from the last election, is at a local level, debating and having to answer people's questions on should they tactically vote.
Yeah.
And should we stand a candidate? Should we split the vote? And it means people and the Greens and the Lib Dems, agreeing which seats to stand on, a few of them, and you get people saying, well, I can't vote for the party I want to vote for.
Yeah.
And it leads to all of that extra sort of argument, discussion, pain, which you would do away with if you had a decent PR system.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think even my personal view, if I may interrupt, is that even in the present system, that was a mistake. In 2017 here in Brighton, for example, we stood down in Brighton Kemp Town, which was held by the Tories at the time. Labour romped home with a Corbynite candidate, he's actually a very good MP, Lloyd Russell Moyle, and he got a 10,000 majority straight off. So there was absolutely no point in us standing down there. All it meant was in the most important city in the country for us, we had to start again from scratch last year, with local elections coming up where we wanted to win seats in that constituency. And I remember when I was a parliamentary candidate back in 2005 in Oxford, West and Abingdon. And there, now the Oxford Green Party is very much based in the east part of Oxford East constituency. But I got more votes than our candidate in Oxford East, and almost exactly the same. We both got about 4% of the votes. There was a lower turnout in Oxford East. And so we were in a position, that was something we could build on, and we could have built a party in Abingdon and so on. There's certainly potential for Greens in that part of the world, just as much as in Brighton or Norwich or any of those other places. And yet I saw not only that in 2019, we stood down in favour of the Lib Dems, and in 2017 as well, the last two elections, we have been without a candidate in what should be a very promising constituency for us. Frankly, I think that's crazy. But that's my opinion. Not everyone in the party, including a lot of people much higher up in it than I am, would agree with that.
Johnny, did you?
Let's go backwards. Surely that people much higher up than I am is part of the problem, but let's leave that aside.
Well, yeah, that's for another day.
Exactly, that's a whole long conversation. Yeah, but when you were talking about whether the Green Party stands a chance or not, basically that's how I recall what you were saying. And in the very small amount of canvassing I was doing for Bridget, and I don't know if John Gibbons is still on here, there were many people who I knocked on the door to who said, I would vote for the Green Party if I thought they stood a chance.
Yeah, yeah.
To which my response was, if all the people who thought they might stand a chance actually voted for them, it would be a landslide.
Yeah, quite. Yeah. Well, I mean, even 10 years ago, when we eventually won in Brighton Pavilion, we had our basic campaign. It was a three-cornered fight between us, the Labour and the Tories. We were actually quite confident of winning because of previous results in local elections and the European elections, even though we'd come third in 2005. And we did win narrowly. But the campaign was largely based on persuading people that countering the Labour Party's argument that we had no chance of winning. It's on the simple, rather stupid basis that we'd never won before. And it is crazy that we have to do that, even in places where we're strong. But the point is that, 20 years ago, that was exactly the position we were in Brighton. But we developed a strategy, and we had to work extremely hard at it. But bit by bit, the party was able to build up from that position, build a base in one ward and then in a second ward, all the things with, the target to win system, where it happened to work because it was done, I think, very assiduously and intelligently. But you've got to find ways around that, and building a base at ward level, that's where you start, where you have to. We've got no alternative in this party because we don't get media support, we haven't got the money of the big parties, and so on. So we've got no choice, but we can win locally. And then there are tactics like saying, arguments which I'm sure you've used, saying, well, what do you think? If you think we should have a chance, well, why don't you in a local election? I don't know what kind of whether you have annual elections or it's all elected at once. How is it where you are?
Every 4 years.
Sorry?
Every 4 years.
Every 4 years. Well, in that case, I mean, you can. I'm sure you do say this, which is what we used to do and still do sometimes here, which was, well, if you think we should, we deserve to be there, well, give us one of your
To
votes.
go. Yeah.
It's a foot in the door principle. Give us one of your votes. You can give 2 votes to the Tories or Labour, whoever it might be, Lib Dems, I don't know who you've got there, and 1 to us, and see how it goes. And then see if you get a Green councillor elected, see how they do. Because one thing which is sure, one thing I've certainly noticed, is that where Green councillors are elected, generally speaking, they get re-elected. And that's because it's a very important part of the party's philosophy, the idea of representation, of listening to people. And therefore action, and you've got a lot of Green people, more than the other parties, I think, who are prepared to do it as a full-time job, even if they only get their 13,000 a year or whatever it is as allowances. Most people, Green people, aren't money-minded anyway. And therefore they do tend to actually be pretty effective councillors, and therefore they get re-elected. So it's all finding ways to put in the door, and this other thing of saying, if you want to vote for one candidate, for one Green, well, please vote for this one. This is our favoured candidate. And then if all the people who want one Green elected vote for that candidate, then we're more likely to get all those tactics, which I'm sure you use. But there are ways of kind of getting around the system, or at least trying to turn it to our advantage, so that we just get in there. But it's this crazy thing is it is such a bloody long effort, compared with the gravity of the crisis as it is now.
I think that's the point. There's the long haul and the short haul.
Yeah.
The parliamentary system is the long haul system. Yeah. We have to keep plugging away at it. But as Johnny says, we don't have time to wait for change to go through Westminster and back locally. Right. So we need to look at more local solutions, in my view. So I'm all in favour of looking at bringing participatory democracy back to the local level through citizens' assemblies and that sort of mechanism.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, the new Green Council here in Brighton, as you know, we've through the Labour Party's own fault, we've managed to win back control of the council. And one of the first things they have done is to introduce some citizens' assemblies for 1 or 2 measures.
All for it.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, conscious of time and Tom's time, so I think we'll wrap up there. Unless anyone else has got anything urgent they want to say. Can we thank? Go on, Johnny. Quick one.
I just want to say thank you to everybody. You are awesome.
You too, Johnny.
It was a great explanation. Thank you so much, Tom.
Really useful, Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Round of applause.
Let me say thank you very much for being such an engaged audience and for putting up with my monologue for so long in the first.
No, it's very good.
It's been a great pleasure meeting you all. I hope to see you again. I'm sorry I couldn't go down and actually meet you in a physical meeting this time. Probably. Where are you actually? Where are you based? Which is
just west of Bristol.
West of Bristol.
North Somerset. So Weston-super-Mare is the biggest
I
town.
see as far over as that. I had
Weston-super-Mare.
Yeah.
Portishead.
I'm sure.
Nailsy.
Okay.
Super-Mare.
I'll see you at a party conference or something.
Clevedon Pier, the best pier, grade 1 pier in the country, the only grade 1 pier.
Oh, well, there you go.
Come and see us sometime.
Yeah.
Great session. Thank you, Tom.
Being a Brightonian, I'm all in favour of piers.
We got 2 in Weston.
Not political ones.
Oh, no. The type that stick into the sea. Okay, well, lovely to meet you all, and thank you again very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you for your time.